Okay, I had you all watch the Historyville 1884 Berlin Conference video on YouTube. Historyville is a website that enlightens and informs about past events in Nigeria, Africa, and the rest of the world. The website is put together by Ayomide Akimbode. He's an author, a broadcast journalist, researcher, and writer. And this particular video, he has a ton of videos on his website, but this particular video goes into significant detail about the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference of 1884 is the second wave of colonialism. The conference took place from November 15th of 1884 to February 26th of 1885. At this conference, the primary goal, the aim of this conference was to decide on how to partition off Africa to the European countries that were represented there, how to divvy Africa up, right? They say divide Africa up like a piece of cake. In the video, the narrator says that it was a large scale legalized daylight robbery. So this is meant to indicate the Europeans' attitude about the continent of Africa as being up for grabs, that they did not make the decision in hiding. It was a very public conference. Several European countries were involved. And during that conference, the goal was to legally formalize all of the newly outlined boundaries and territories. They openly determined several things. One, that African people were uncivilized and irrelevant. Now, mind you, by 1884, we have ended the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade begins in around 1619 and officially ends in the United States in 1863 with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Berlin Conference is some 21 years later, and we're still trying to figure out ways to pillage and exploit Africa and African people, right? So there have been some almost 400 years of exploitation of African people through the transatlantic slave trade and the institutionalization of slavery. And in addition to that, we're also seeing that after we've ended the transatlantic slave trade, not just in the United States, there were still some people who were practicing slavery, and actually the U.S. was too. There were still a couple of slave ships that came in after the Emancipation Proclamation, but so it was practiced in the United States and South America as well still. The Berlin Conference goes on to continue that exploitation of Africa and African people. They had long deemed African people as uncivilized and irrelevant. They had the right, they also had decided at the conference that they had a right to all of the resources of the continent. And I would argue that they actually had decided that much earlier, back in the 1600s, when they started taking African people from the continent. And three, they only needed to be in agreement with each other, with other European countries, about who got what. They didn't have to concern themselves with what African people thought and felt, or had to be concerned about the ways that they divvied up the land. It was organized by Otto von Bismarck. I want you to know who he is, and what his investment was in organizing this conference. What is meant by it was large, I've already explained that. What was the rationale for the European invasion? So the public rationale, or the propaganda, the rhetoric for the invasion of Europeans in Africa, was that Africans were uncivilized and incapable of utilizing their resources effectively, or making decisions, and that Europe would be their savior. Europe would come in and civilize them and bring them up in society, and create a more civilized African. This slide here tells you several of the countries that were represented there, but there is a longer list, and I want you to know that list. This diagram shows the way that they divided up the continent and to whom it was given. And then this diagram shows the most prominent resources in those particular areas that they were mining or stealing. The Berlin Conference is also called the Scramble for Africa. When you hear the term scramble for Africa, it constitutes the period between 1885 and 1914 when European countries are literally scrambling to try to get as much of the resources out of Africa as they can. So how did the conference come to be? Significant players are Henry Morton Stanley, King Leopold II. King Leopold II is really a critical person in the horrific amount of violence that was committed against the Congo people in the late 1800s. We often talk about the atrocities of the Holocaust, and we don't usually consider the atrocities of King Leopold II. He murdered approximately 15 million people in the Congo, 10 to 15 million people. He was brutal. He was brutal in his exacting of punishment. He was mining rubber in the area. And for him, if you came in short of your daily quota, he often cut off hands or feet. I would argue that King Leopold II was masochistic or a sadist. I think that he must have gotten some pleasure out of the kinds of torture that he committed against people in the Congo. So Henry Morton Stanley. So there had been rumors about the riches on the continent of Africa. Henry Morton Stanley discovers, in air quotes, discovers the Congo River Basin in 1874. No, King Leopold was already there. He had developed the International African Society once Morton Stanley figured or discovered the Congo River Basin. King Leopold created, with Stanley Morton, created the International Congo Society. France also got in on, became very interested in Africa and the Congo, and sent Pierre Sauvignon de Bressa, who created Brazzaville in the Congo area. So there's interest in Africa's wealth and what Africa's resources can contribute to the growth of European empire. And so they have this conference. Von Bismarck is concerned with the exploitation that he's already doing on the continent. So he wants to make sure that they come into an agreement on how they will exploit the continent of Africa. Of course, they didn't include any of the ruling people who were in Africa. King Menelik, an Ethiopian leader, wrote them saying that they didn't need Europeans' protection, so they didn't need for Europe to come in and settle in their area and colonize the area. Ethiopia and Liberia are the only two countries that weren't fully colonized. Liberia was never colonized at all, and then I think Ethiopia, just a small segment of Ethiopia, was colonized eventually. The General Act made provisions for different trade routes, the framework for colonization. It addressed different issues bordering on the colonization of African countries. It confirmed the Congo as a free state, as private property of King Leopold II. So he wasn't governed by anyone. He didn't have to be in compliance with anyone. and he ran the Congo as he saw fit. It confirmed the trade proposal by making the Niger and Congo rivers free for ship traffic. So if you remember this slide, trade colonialism, when we're forcing the opening of ports for Western powers, that comes out of this Berlin conference. The General Act also included the signing of the international prohibition of the slave trade. So it officially renders slavery as ended or abolished. And it establishes the principles of effectivity, the principle of effectivity or effective occupation of the state is that European powers had to acquire rights over colonial lands by possessing them or effectively occupying them. That doesn't mean that they had to settle on them, but they did have to have treaties with local leaders. They had to be flying their flag there. They had to establish a governing system in the territory. They had to establish some disciplinary force, a police force, a military force, in order to say that they had full control over the space. And they had to get approval by the other European countries to recognize them as the occupying power or the colonizing power of that location. So it was all very much an agreement between Europeans. The lasting impact of colonization, there's several. The external and intramural conversations, so external and internal conflicts between countries and ethnic groups. The continued invasion of Africa and plundering of her resources. They are still plundering Africa's resources. The establishment of governments that were and are corrupt. The dispossession of lands, the introduction of disease, the stealing of cultural artifacts, resources, and people, the disruption of natural agricultural methods, effectively killing the African ecological system, causing drought and barren lands and producing famine. These are all significant impacts of the 1884 Berlin Conference and the long history of colonization. Okay, so I'll end this video here.